The old house stood at the edge of a foggy forest, its silhouette barely visible against the darkening sky. The heavy clouds above seemed to swallow any trace of light, leaving the land beneath bathed in an unsettling twilight. The wind howled through the trees, whispering secrets of the past. And in that silence, a group of friends made their way up the winding path to the door. There was Jake, the daring one who always seemed to find trouble, yet had an infectious laugh that made everyone around him feel at ease. He had suggested this getaway, a weekend in a remote cabin to escape the stresses of everyday life. His charm and enthusiasm were contagious, and despite the unease the house stirred in them, no one had hesitated to join. Sarah, the thoughtful and grounded one, followed close behind. Her wide eyes were scanning their surroundings, feeling the shift in the air, the way the temperature seemed to drop just as they approached the house. She had grown up with a healthy skepticism of the unknown, but this place, something about it made her skin crawl. Then there was David, the quiet observer. He wasn't as loud as Jake, but his presence was constant, steady. David had a calm demeanor that could usually defuse any tension, but tonight, he seemed distracted, his eyes flicking toward the forest, as if someone was watching them. Next came Emily, the dreamer, the one who always believed in the impossible. She was the first to smile as they reached the door, though the smile didn't reach her eyes. The darkness of the house was almost too much for her to ignore, but she didn't want to be the one to ruin the mood. And last, but certainly not least, was Mark. He was the skeptic, the one who didn't believe in ghosts or anything that went bump in the night. He was here for the adventure, to prove to everyone else that they were just overreacting. But even he couldn't ignore the unsettling sensation creeping up his spine as they stood in front of the door. Jake pushed open the heavy wooden door, the hinges creaking loudly, the sound echoing through the stillness. Inside, the house smelled old, a mixture of must and something more metallic. The floorboards groaned under their weight as they stepped inside. Their flashlights illuminated the walls, revealing faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. The furniture was covered in thick dust, some of it draped with white sheets like ghosts waiting to be disturbed. "Not bad," Jake said, his voice bouncing off the walls, but it lacked his usual enthusiasm. "A little spooky. Sure, but that's part of the charm, right?" "Yeah, if charm means we might be trapped in here with a ghost," Mark joked, though there was an edge to his voice. They all laughed nervously, but the tension in the room was palpable. Sarah shuddered as she stepped deeper into the house. Her flashlight flickered, and she quickly twisted the handle, trying to get it to work again. "Don't worry," Emily said, her voice light but her eyes betraying her unease. "It's probably just the wiring. It's an old house." David didn't respond, but his eyes never left the dark corners of the room. Something felt off. The air felt thicker here, heavier, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something. He caught a glimpse of movement in the shadow of the farthest corner, but when he looked again, there was nothing. The others continued exploring, but David lingered by the door, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He didn't want to admit it, but something was wrong. The house, with its abandoned stillness, seemed to pulse with a life of its own. There was something in it, something hidden in the dark. "Hey, check this out," Jake called from the kitchen. "It's like a time capsule in here. Old plates, cups, even a dusty bottle of wine. Maybe we should open it up and toast to the weekend." Mark made his way to the kitchen, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. "You guys do whatever, but I'm not drinking anything from this place. Who knows how old it is? Suit yourself," Jake laughed, but the sound seemed strange, as if it was lost in the house's empty chambers. Sarah moved toward the staircase, her eyes narrowing as she looked up into the dark abyss above. The stairs creaked as she took her first step, her hand gripping the railing as if it would keep her from falling. Something tugged at her chest. Something in the air was wrong, but she couldn't quite place it. David joined her at the bottom of the stairs. "You feel that?" She nodded, her face pale. "It's like the house is alive and watching us." David glanced up the staircase again. "It feels like we're being watched, but there's no one else here." The temperature in the room seemed to drop even further, as if the house was drawing in the cold from the night outside. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a loud bang from upstairs. "What the hell was that?" Emily gasped, her heart racing. Everyone turned toward the stairs, their faces pale. The house, once quiet, now seemed to hum with tension. There was no wind, no reason for the noise. It was as though something or someone had struck the floor above them with a heavy hand. Mark, trying to cover his unease, scoffed. "It's just the house settling. Happens all the time." But the others weren't convinced. They stood frozen, staring up at the shadowed hallway above them. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps followed, the sound coming closer. But no one was moving upstairs. There was no one there. "Is someone up there?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Before anyone could respond, the air turned even colder. A shadow flickered just beyond the edge of the staircase, moving with unnatural speed. It darted from one side to the other, vanishing into the dark, as if it knew they were watching. "What was that?" Emily whispered, her breath catching in her throat. The footsteps came again, closer now, more pronounced. But no one was visible. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died, plunging the entire house into darkness. The only sound that filled the air was the frantic beating of their hearts. In the suffocating silence, the unmistakable sound of whispering began to rise from the dark corners of the house, like a dozen voices or more, all murmuring unintelligibly. The whispers grew louder, sharper, until they felt like they were pressing against their very minds. And then, the floorboards creaked behind them, the unmistakable sound of something or someone moving. They spun around, flashlights trembling in their hands. But the only thing they saw was the thick black void of the hallway. And yet, the feeling of being watched had never been so intense. In the distance, something moved. Something large. "Who's there?" Jake shouted into the dark. But there was no answer. Only the echoes of his voice bouncing off the walls. The floor beneath their feet groaned, and for a moment, it felt as though the house itself was shuddering. And then the whispering stopped. The silence was absolute. And in that silence, they all realized one thing. Something was not just lurking in the dark. It was waiting, and it was getting closer. The cold silence in the house pressed down on them, thick and suffocating. The sound of their breathing echoed through the halls, too loud, too sharp against the stillness. The flashlight beams wavered in their trembling hands, casting fleeting shadows on the walls as they all stood frozen in place. They knew something was wrong. Something was there in the darkness with them, but none of them dared to move. "Did you hear that?" Sarah's voice broke the silence, barely above a whisper. Her eyes were wide with fear as she looked around at the others. It's like it's right here." Jake shook his head, trying to brush off the rising panic. "It's nothing, just the house settling. Let's stay calm." But his voice, usually so full of confidence, wavered. Even he couldn't ignore the chill that had settled over them, or the way the house seemed to be closing in. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the air felt charged, heavy, like something was pressing against them from all sides. David took a slow, steadying breath, his mind racing. He had always been the quiet one, the observer, but tonight, even he couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. He glanced over at Emily, whose face was pale, her hand gripping the flashlight so tightly her knuckles were white. "Let's get out of here," Emily murmured, her voice shaking. She took a step back, but her foot hit something, and she froze. Her eyes widened in panic as she realized she had knocked over a glass vase on the floor. It shattered with a loud crash, and the sound seemed to amplify in the darkness, making the air feel even thicker. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Mark snapped, his nerves fraying as he tried to keep it together. He turned to face Emily, but his eyes were darting around the room, unwilling to rest on any one spot for too long. "I didn't," Emily began, but before she could finish, another noise cut her off. This time, it was a low, guttural growl, faint but unmistakable. It came from somewhere behind them, from the depths of the hallway they had just crossed. Everyone froze. "Did anyone else hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a breath. "I heard it," Jake said, his usual bravado gone. His hands were shaking as he gripped the flashlight. "We're not alone." The shadows in the hallway seemed to move. At first, it was subtle. A flicker here, a ripple there. But as they all stared into the dark, the movement grew more pronounced. Something was shifting in the corners of the room, something that couldn't be explained. "Turn on the lights," Mark barked, his voice rising in frustration. "The fuse must have blown. This place is falling apart." David stepped forward, his eyes still glued to the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want to admit it, but he could feel it now. There was something in the house, something watching them, something just beyond the reach of the light. "Maybe we should check the fuse box," David suggested, though his voice was uncertain. "It's in the basement, right? Are you out of your mind?" Mark snapped. "We're not going down there. We don't have a choice," David replied, his voice calm but firm. "We need the lights, and we can't just stand here." Emily looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. What if it's down there? What if we're not supposed to go down there?" David's gaze softened, but the weight of the situation was starting to press on him. "If we stay here, it'll find us. We need to move. Stick together." They all hesitated, the uncertainty hanging heavy in the air. The darkness around them felt alive now, the whispers they had heard before creeping back into their minds. The cold seemed to seep deeper into their bones, chilling them to the core. Jake took a deep breath, clearly trying to muster some courage. "All right, we'll go to the basement, but we stay together. No one splits up." "Agreed," Sarah said quietly. Her voice was steadier now, though her eyes still darted nervously to the shadows. With one final, collective breath, they moved. Slowly at first, each of them stepping lightly, as if they feared that any sudden movement might set something off. The hallway felt longer than before, as if the walls were stretching, closing in on them. The stairs creaked beneath their feet as they descended into the basement, the air growing colder with each step. The flashlight beams flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The basement door stood at the end of the stairs, its surface warped with age. David pushed it open, and they all stepped inside. The basement was even worse than the rest of the house. The air was thick with dust, and the shelves were lined with old, forgotten objects. Cobwebs hung like curtains in the corners. There was a faint smell of mildew, but it wasn't the musty scent of age that made their stomachs churn. It was something else, something harder to define. It was as if the very air was soaked with memories, and none of them were pleasant. The fuse box was in the far corner, near a collection of old wooden crates. As they approached, the hairs on the back of David's neck stood up. He could feel it now, the presence that had been following them since they entered the house. It was close, too close. He could almost hear its breath, ragged and wet, just behind him. He reached for the fuse box, but as his hand touched the metal, a loud bang came from upstairs. A door slamming shut, followed by rapid footsteps, like someone or something was running. "Run!" Jake shouted. The group scattered, panic taking hold. They rushed up the stairs, each of them moving as fast as they could, but it was as though the house was pulling them back, slowing them down. The walls seemed to press in, the darkness getting thicker with every step. As they reached the top of the stairs, they heard the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, scraping against the walls, dragging itself closer. The sound was low, almost like a growl, but now it was joined by another sound. A soft, haunting whisper that seemed to echo through every corner of the house. And then, from the darkness, a figure appeared. It was tall, too tall, its shape indistinct, its edges blurred by the shadows. The air seemed to freeze around it, and as it stepped into the light, its eyes gleamed, a deep, unnatural red. The group froze, paralyzed by fear. It was impossible to look away. The creature took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. The whispering grew louder, clearer, until it felt like the very walls were vibrating with the sound. And then, just as the thing reached out toward them, everything went black. David gasped, his breath coming in short, frantic bursts as he stumbled backward. His mind raced, still trying to process what he had just seen. Those eyes, glowing a deep, unnatural red, fixed on him as if they could see into his very soul. The coldness in the air around him deepened, and he felt like he was suffocating, like the house itself was trying to crush him. But then, just as suddenly as the figure had appeared, it was gone. The room went eerily silent. The darkness that had enveloped them seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, but there was no sign of the creature. It was as if it had melted into the shadows, vanishing without a trace. David's heart pounded in his chest, the sound deafening in his ears. He could barely hear the frantic footsteps of the others as they backed away, their eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of movement. "Where did it go?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She clutched the flashlight like a lifeline, her fingers white from the pressure. I don't know," David stammered, trying to steady his breathing. He didn't want to admit it, but he could feel it. That thing was still here. It hadn't just disappeared. It was waiting, watching, and somehow they were all part of its game. Mark was the first to speak, his voice shaky but forceful. "This isn't real. This is some sort of trick. We're all just freaking out because we're in a creepy house. There's no monster." But even as he said the words, his eyes flickered nervously around the room, betraying the doubt in his voice. David wanted to believe Mark. He wanted to laugh it off, to chalk it up to the stress of being in an old house at night. But the way the air felt, thick, heavy, as if something was pressing down on them, told him otherwise. The terror that had gripped him in that instant was still there, crawling beneath his skin, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted. "We need to leave," Emily said, her voice small, almost too quiet to hear. She was pale, her hands shaking as she gripped the flashlight like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "This place isn't safe." "Emily's right," Jake added, his voice low. "We need to get out of here now. We're not getting any answers staying here." David shook his head. He could feel it, the pull of the house, the way it seemed to beckon them to stay. It wasn't just fear. There was something about this place, something that held them captive, even without the creature lurking in the shadows. "No, we can't just leave," David said firmly, though his voice was laced with uncertainty. "We don't know what's out there, and we don't know if we're safe anywhere else. But we can't stay here either." He looked at each of them, his eyes full of quiet desperation. "We need a plan." They all stood in a tense silence, unsure of what to do next. The house seemed to press in on them, the air growing colder, heavier, with each passing second. Then, from the corner of the room, there was a faint creak, a sound so soft that at first, David thought he had imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. Step, step, step. It was coming closer, and this time they all heard it. Their hearts raced in unison, and the panic in their eyes was palpable. David felt his stomach drop. There was no mistaking it now. Something or someone was moving toward them in the dark. "Hide!" Mark hissed, his voice frantic. Without waiting for a response, he darted behind a stack of old crates, the others following in a blur of movement. David moved quickly, his mind racing. Where could they go? Where could they hide? The room was too open, too exposed. But then he spotted it, the doorway at the far end of the room, leading to what looked like a small storage closet. He gestured frantically at the others, and one by one, they rushed toward it, squeezing inside. The door creaked as it closed behind them, and they huddled together in the darkness, each of them holding their breath. The only sound was their ragged breathing, but even that seemed too loud, too obvious. Outside the closet, the steps grew closer, slow and deliberate, like whoever or whatever was walking wanted them to know it was there. The tension in the air was thick, unbearable. David could feel his heart pounding in his chest, and his skin prickled with the sense that they were being watched. From the cracks in the closet door, they could just make out a faint shadow moving across the room. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its shape was distorted, like it didn't belong in the space. It moved with an unnatural, fluid grace, gliding through the room as if it were part of the darkness itself. David held his breath, his body trembling. He could feel the heat from Emily beside him, her small form pressed against his, but he didn't dare make a sound, not even a whisper. Every instinct in him screamed that they couldn't let the thing know they were here. The shadow moved past the closet, its presence lingering in the air even after it had gone. But then, just as David thought they might be safe, the floorboards creaked. A heavy footstep. The thing had stopped. For a long, torturous moment, there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just silence. But then, a voice, a soft, guttural whisper, came from the darkness. "I see you." David's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't coming from anywhere in particular. It was as if it was coming from everywhere at once. Inside their heads, inside the very walls of the house. It was everywhere and nowhere, and it sent a shiver down his spine. The others were frozen beside him, their eyes wide with terror. None of them dared to speak, to move, to even breathe. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. "I can smell you." David felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. His pulse raced, and he could hear his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew thick with an oppressive, suffocating presence. And then, as quickly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The room fell silent once more. The footsteps resumed, but they were fading now, moving away. It was like whatever it was had lost interest in them. Or maybe it was just playing with them. David waited, counting the seconds, before he slowly eased the door open. They stepped out one by one, careful not to make a sound, and the house seemed to hold its breath with them. But there was no sign of the creature now. No whisper, no movement, just the heavy silence. The darkness felt thicker now, more oppressive. And as they moved further into the house, David couldn't shake the feeling that they were being led somewhere. Somewhere they weren't supposed to be. And in the back of his mind, the voice echoed again. The silence that filled the house after the creature's departure was unnerving. It hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating, as though the house itself had taken a deep breath, holding its contents, waiting for the next terrifying moment. Each step David took felt like an act of defiance against the darkness surrounding him. a darkness that was constantly shifting, as though the very walls of the house were alive and watching. His hand gripped the flashlight, the beam shaking slightly as it illuminated the room around him. The others were close behind, Sarah just a step ahead, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. The faint glow of the flashlight reflected off her glassy gaze, and David couldn't help but wonder if they would all make it out of here alive, or if they would end up becoming part of the house's twisted story. Mark walked alongside David, his expression grim. "That thing. Whatever it is, it's not human," he muttered, his voice low, almost as if speaking the words out loud could make it less real. "It's like it's been here for years, maybe longer." David nodded, the weight of Mark's words pressing down on him. He didn't need to hear the theory to know that it was true. Whatever was lurking in the shadows, it had been here far too long, feeding off the fear it created, thriving in the darkness. And now they were trapped in its game. They passed through the hallway, the floor creaking underfoot with each step. The wallpaper was peeling in places, revealing patches of rotting wood beneath. But it wasn't the decay that unnerved David. It was the whispering, the soft murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. At first, he thought it was just the wind, the house settling, but the whispers grew louder with every step. They sounded like voices, low, indistinct, murmuring things he couldn't understand. But even if he could hear the words, he wasn't sure he wanted to know. The air grew heavier, colder, and David could see the others shivering despite the warmth of their clothes. The house was alive, he realized. Alive in a way that defied logic, that bled into the very bones of the building, making every crack, every creak, seem like a warning. "Can you hear that?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her face was pale, her breath shallow. She was clutching the flashlight so tightly, David thought her fingers might snap. "I hear it," Jake said quietly, glancing over his shoulder, his eyes darting nervously. "It's getting louder." David tried to shake off the unease gnawing at him, but the whispers felt like an invisible hand brushing against his mind. He didn't want to acknowledge it, but they were closing in. The walls were growing tighter, and the darkness was pressing in from every angle, suffocating him. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from somewhere ahead, a door slamming open, or perhaps falling off its hinges. The sound echoed through the hallway, causing them all to jump. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment, everything was plunged into darkness. David felt a cold hand grip his heart. He didn't want to move, didn't want to go any farther, but the door ahead of them beckoned, as if it were part of the puzzle that the house had set for them. They couldn't stop now. "Go," Mark whispered urgently, his voice barely audible over the rush of panic in the group. "We need to find a way out." David didn't argue. The others were already moving, huddling together in a tight cluster, their feet pattering against the creaking wooden floor. He took a deep breath and followed them, each step a beat of his thundering heart. The door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness spilling out from the other side. They reached the door, and David hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The air that hit them was stifling, thick with a musty, moldy odor that made his stomach churn. The room beyond was large, but its exact shape was hard to make out in the dim light. The walls were lined with old furniture, armchairs, bookshelves, and what appeared to be an old, faded rug on the floor. But something about the room felt wrong, like it was a memory the house was trying to trap. As they stepped inside, a chill washed over them. The whispers were louder now, like voices calling from the deepest, most hidden corners of the room. David scanned the room, but there was nothing. No creature, no shadow that moved. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was here, watching them from the dark spaces. Then the door slammed shut behind them, The group froze. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "We're locked in." David tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself was keeping them trapped. He banged on it once, twice, but the door remained immovable. "Relax," Mark said, trying to sound confident. "It's just the house settling. We'll find another way out." But David wasn't convinced. The air in the room had changed. He could feel it, an electric charge hanging in the air, something dark and dangerous waiting to happen. It wasn't just the house. Something was here and it wasn't letting them go. A soft scraping noise came from across the room, faint but distinct. It was the sound of nails against wood. David's heart skipped a beat. "What was that?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David's eyes darted to the far corner of the room, where the noise had originated. The shadows there seemed to grow deeper, thicker, as though something was taking form within them. His pulse quickened, and he stepped forward, trying to make out the shape in the corner. The darkness was moving, shifting, like a living thing, and suddenly he wasn't sure whether his mind was playing tricks on him or if something truly was there. Without warning, the scraping sound grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was in the corner was trying to claw its way out. The air turned freezing cold, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening, until they were no longer whispers at all. The walls of the room seemed to close in on them, the shadows moving with an unnatural fluidity. David could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, the familiar feeling of being watched pressing in on him. And then, the voice came again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a scream. "I see you." David spun around, but there was nothing. The room was empty, the darkness closing in tighter than ever. The temperature plummeted, and for a split second, he could see his breath fogging in the air. Then, from the corner of the room, something stepped forward. A figure tall and thin, its face hidden in shadow, but its eyes glowing bright red. The same eyes that had haunted David earlier. "I told you," the voice hissed, coming from all around them. "I'm watching." The figure took a step closer, and the room seemed to shrink even further. The figure in the corner stood motionless, its eyes glowing red like burning embers. Every instinct in David's body screamed at him to run, to escape, but his feet were frozen to the floor. The air was thick with a suffocating cold, the kind that seemed to crawl under his skin and settle deep within his bones. It felt as if the very room was alive, holding them in place. Mark, Emily, Jake, and Sarah were all silent, their wide eyes fixed on the figure. None of them moved, but David could feel the collective tension in the room, the fear pressing down on them like a physical weight. The whispers were gone, replaced by the pounding of their own hearts, but the silence felt more dangerous than anything they'd heard before. David's breath came out in shallow gasps. The cold in the room was unbearable, but his fear was even worse. He could feel the presence of something more than just a shadow in that corner, something ancient, something hungry. The figure finally moved. Its long, thin arms stretched out in front of it, reaching toward them slowly, as though savoring each moment of their terror. With each step, the shadows seemed to cling to it, like a cloak that grew longer and thicker the closer it came. The room seemed to warp, its edges blurring as if reality itself was starting to fracture. "I warned you," the voice said again, its tone calm and low, but laced with an edge that sent chills down David's spine. It echoed through the room, reverberating in the walls and the floor, until it felt like the house itself was speaking. "This place is mine. And now so are you." David wanted to shout, to scream, to demand answers, but his voice wouldn't come. The fear was so overwhelming, so all-encompassing, that he couldn't even move. He could only stare as the figure took another step closer. Behind him, Emily made a small, terrified sound, a sharp intake of breath. It was enough to break David from his stupor. He snapped his head around, his eyes locking onto hers. Her face was pale, her lips trembling. She was just as terrified as he was, but there was something more in her eyes, something that screamed for them to get out. "David," she whispered, barely audible, but her voice cut through the tension like a knife. "We need to get out of here. Now." He nodded, his throat tight, but as he took a step back, the room seemed to grow smaller. The figure was still advancing, its glowing eyes never leaving their faces. It didn't walk like a human. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like it was something that didn't belong in this world. Jake, who had been standing beside David, grabbed his arm suddenly, pulling him away from the figure. "We have to go," Jake hissed, his voice frantic. "We can't stay here." David didn't need any more encouragement. He turned and ran, his heart pounding in his chest. But as soon as he moved, the figure's voice echoed behind him. "You can't run. Not from me." The words were like ice, freezing him in place. He could feel the weight of them pressing on him, trying to drag him back into the darkness. But he kept moving, ignoring the voice, ignoring the fear clawing at his insides. He had to keep moving. The group ran down the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the narrow space. The sound of their panic-filled breaths filled the air, but every few steps, David could hear the scraping sound again, the sound of nails on wood. It was coming from behind them, getting closer with every heartbeat. They reached the door at the end of the hallway, the one they had passed earlier, but it was locked. David pulled at the handle, his fingers numb with cold, but the door wouldn't budge. "Move!" Mark shouted, his voice desperate. He kicked the door hard, his boot making a loud thud against the wood. Another step. The scraping sound grew louder, closer, faster. David didn't know what to do. They were trapped, the creature hunting them, and the house itself seemed to be closing in on them. He could feel the walls pressing in, the air growing thicker, heavier. The whispers were back, but now they weren't whispers. They were voices, thousands of voices, all speaking at once. The door gave way with a loud crack, and they all stumbled through into the next room. It was larger than the others, but darker. The windows were covered with thick, black curtains that blocked out the light, leaving the room bathed in shadows. The air was stifling, the temperature having dropped so low that David could see his breath as he exhaled. There was a large, old fireplace on one side of the room, but it was cold and dark, just like the rest of the room. And then, David saw something that made his stomach drop. On the far wall, a mirror. But it wasn't just any mirror. It was ancient, its surface cracked and warped, as though it had been here for centuries. It was covered in dust, but the reflection was clear. And it wasn't just their own faces staring back at them. The figure from the corner of the room, the one with the glowing red eyes, was reflected in the glass, standing behind them. It was closer now, closer than before, and David could feel its gaze on him even though he hadn't turned around. "Look," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She pointed at the mirror, her fingers shaking. "It's behind us." David spun around, but the figure wasn't there. There was nothing but empty space. He felt his breath catch in his throat. How could it be in the mirror but not in the room? "Stay together," David said, his voice low but firm. "We need to keep moving." The others nodded, but David could see the doubt in their eyes. They were all thinking the same thing. The house wasn't just haunted by something. It was alive, and it was feeding on their fear, drawing them deeper into its grip. The floor creaked beneath them as they moved toward the far side of the room, the only other exit visible. David could feel the eyes on him again, But when he glanced around, there was nothing there. It was as though the house itself was playing tricks on him. And then, a voice, a whisper, soft and sweet, but laced with malice, drifted through the air. "Don't run. You'll never escape." David spun toward the sound, but there was nothing. The whispering was louder now, too many voices speaking at once, filling his ears with their words. He couldn't tell where one voice ended and another began, but they were all saying the same thing. "You'll never escape." And then the mirror shattered. The sound of the mirror shattering echoed through the room like a bomb, shattering the silence and cutting through the tension that had been hanging in the air. Pieces of glass rained down onto the floor, sparkling in the dim light, but they didn't make a sound as they hit the ground. It was as if the house itself had swallowed up any noise. David stood frozen, his eyes wide, his heart pounding in his chest. The reflection that had once been there was gone, and for a moment, he thought it might have been some sort of illusion. But the panic in his chest told him otherwise. The creature, the one with the glowing red eyes, was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. He quickly turned to look at the others. Emily was standing closest to him, her face pale and full of fear. Her hands were trembling, but she managed to grip onto the edge of the table in front of her. Mark was the next closest, his fists clenched at his sides, his body tense like a coiled spring. Sarah and Jake were behind them, their faces full of the same fear, but there was something else in their eyes too, something that spoke of desperation. "We need to get out of here," David said, his voice firm but shaky. "We can't keep running. We have to find a way to leave this house." His words hung in the air for a moment, unanswered. The house seemed to hold its breath as they all stared at each other, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. I can't take this anymore," Emily said, her voice cracking. She turned away from David and walked towards the door, her steps slow and hesitant. She reached for the handle, but as soon as her fingers touched it, the door rattled violently, as if something heavy was pounding on the other side. "Don't touch it," Mark shouted, his voice sharp. He grabbed her arm and pulled her away from the door. "It's not going to open. Nothing's going to work here." David stepped forward, trying to steady his breathing. "Mark's right. There's something wrong with this house. We can't just leave the way we came in." "What do we do then?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do we get out of here?" Before David could answer, the room grew colder, the air thickening with an oppressive, suffocating feeling. The whispers returned, louder this time and more insistent. They were all around them, coming from the walls, from the floor, from the very air itself. The words blurred together, but they all carried the same message. "You will never leave." David's breath caught in his throat as he scanned the room, his eyes darting from one shadow to the next. There was no escape. Every corner, every inch of the room felt like it was closing in on them, trapping them further. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the far side of the room, followed by the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, scraping across the floor. The sound was slow, deliberate, each dragging noise sending a fresh wave of terror through David's body. "Run!" David shouted, his heart racing. Without thinking, he turned and bolted for the door, pulling Emily and Mark behind him. They were all moving fast now, their footsteps echoing in the narrow, dark hallway. The only light was the faint glow from the windows, but even that seemed to flicker and dim with every passing second. Behind them, the scraping sound grew louder, more frantic. David didn't dare look back, but he could feel the presence of the creature drawing closer. He could hear its breath, low and ragged, like something struggling to contain itself. They reached the end of the hallway and found themselves standing in front of another door. This one looked no different from the others they had encountered, but there was a sense of finality about it. A feeling that if they opened it, they might be stepping into something even worse. David hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The whispers were back, this time louder, as though the house itself was speaking directly to him. "It's too late. You'll never escape." Mark, sensing David's hesitation, grabbed his arm. "We have no choice. We have to try." With a sharp breath, David twisted the doorknob and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. Beyond the door, there was a staircase winding down into complete darkness. "This place," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "It's endless." They stepped into the staircase, the air growing colder with every step they took. The darkness below them was absolute, as if the staircase descended into an abyss. But there was no going back. They had already crossed the point of no return. "Stay close," David warned, his voice low and steady. "Don't let anyone fall behind." The staircase spiraled down deeper and deeper, each step feeling like they were sinking further into the house's grip. The walls were bare, nothing but cold stone and the faint smell of something damp and rotten. As they moved further down, the air grew heavier, and the feeling of being watched intensified. And then, just as David thought they couldn't go any further, the staircase ended. They found themselves standing in a small, dimly lit room, its walls covered in what appeared to be old, decaying wallpaper. The air was thick with dust, and the silence was deafening. It felt wrong, unnatural, like the house had intentionally led them here. "Where are we?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure where they were either. He tried to look around, but the shadows seemed to shift and twist, as if they were alive. There was something else in the room, though, something David hadn't noticed at first. On the far wall, partially obscured by shadows, was a large, ornate mirror. Its surface was covered in grime, but David could make out the faintest outline of something or someone on the other side. His heart raced as he stepped closer, the others following behind him. As they got closer to the mirror, David could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The figure in the mirror was a woman, her face pale and twisted with an expression of sheer terror. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and staring directly at him, as though she were trapped inside the glass. He froze, and then the woman in the mirror started to move. David's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the woman in the mirror. Her face, pale and twisted, seemed to flicker like a dying light bulb. Her eyes, wide, desperate, locked onto his with a chilling intensity. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The house, the shadows, the whispers. It all faded into nothing. All that remained was that mirror and the woman trapped inside. Her lips parted, her mouth forming words that David couldn't hear. But her expression was unmistakable. "Help me." David took a step forward, his hand reaching out toward the mirror. He didn't know why. Something deep inside him told him not to, that touching the mirror would be a mistake. But he couldn't stop himself. The feeling that this woman was somehow connected to the dark forces in the house was overwhelming, and he knew they couldn't leave without understanding what was happening. As his fingers brushed the glass, a jolt of cold ran through his body, sharp and biting. It was like the mirror was alive, pulsing under his touch. The woman's face twisted into a grotesque grin, her eyes narrowing to slits. The once pleading expression was gone, replaced by something far more sinister. Before David could pull away, the mirror shuddered violently, the surface rippling like water disturbed by a stone. The room around him seemed to warp, the shadows in the corners stretching and twisting. The air turned thick with an unnatural pressure, squeezing in on them from all sides. "David, get away from it!" Emily's voice screamed from behind him. David tried to pull his hand back, but it felt as if the mirror was holding him in place, pulling him deeper into the reflection. His heart raced, panic rising in his chest. The woman's grin widened, and for a brief moment, David thought he saw something move behind her. Something large, dark, and monstrous. "David!" Mark shouted again, his voice desperate. But his warning came too late. Suddenly, the glass cracked. A loud, bone-chilling sound echoed through the room as the mirror splintered into jagged shards, some of them falling to the floor, others seemingly suspended in the air. The woman's face distorted, shifting into a nightmarish visage. Her mouth stretched open in a silent scream. Then, with a sharp crack, she disappeared completely, leaving only the empty, cracked mirror. David stumbled back, his hands still trembling from the contact. The room was silent again, the tension in the air thick and suffocating. The others were frozen in place, their faces as pale as the walls surrounding them. "What the hell was that?" Mark breathed, his voice shaking. David couldn't answer. He felt as if his mind was reeling, as though the very fabric of reality had been torn. The house had already been twisted, but now it felt like something had been awakened. Something old and angry. He didn't know what they had just unleashed, but he had a feeling it was much worse than they could ever imagine. "Is it over?" Emily whispered, her eyes flicking nervously to the cracks in the mirror. "I don't know," David replied, his voice low, "but I don't think it's done with us yet." Just as the words left his mouth, the temperature in the room dropped. It was sudden, biting, as if the walls themselves had exhaled a cold breath. The shadows, which had already seemed unnatural, now shifted and moved in the corners of the room, as though they had a life of their own. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. "Now?" But as she turned to the door, her hand hovering over the handle, the sound of scraping filled the room again. The same slow, deliberate noise they had heard earlier. It was coming from all sides, crawling up the walls, from beneath the floorboards, as if something was dragging itself through the house. David spun around, his heart hammering. The shadows had grown darker, more oppressive. They pressed in on him, filling his vision, distorting the room into a chaotic swirl of blackness. "Where's the way out?" Jake asked, his voice trembling as he backed away from the door. "We're trapped, aren't we?" David's mind raced. The staircase, the hallways, the rooms they had explored. Everything felt like a dead end now, each step leading them further into the heart of the house's madness. He couldn't explain why, but every instinct told him they weren't meant to escape. A sudden, sharp screech cut through the air, making them all flinch. The walls around them seemed to pulse, vibrating with an unseen force. Then, from the corner of the room, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, its features hidden in the darkness, but its presence was unmistakable. Its form rippled with darkness, its outline barely discernible. It moved like smoke, shifting and twisting, stretching unnaturally long. As it stepped closer, its features slowly came into focus. Its eyes glowed red, its grin wide and twisted, showing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It was the creature from the hallway, the one they had glimpsed in the dark, the one whose presence they had felt but couldn't see until now. And now it was standing before them. "Stay back," David shouted, his voice cracking with fear. But it was too late. The creature was upon them, its cold, glowing eyes fixed on him, its breath ragged and heavy. Without thinking, David grabbed a shard of the broken mirror from the floor and held it up in front of him, hoping it might offer some kind of protection. But the creature didn't flinch. It didn't even seem to notice the glass. Instead, It took a step closer, its grin widening. And then, with a voice that echoed in David's mind, the creature spoke. "You cannot escape," it said, its voice like a rasping whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You will be mine." David's heart pounded in his chest. The others were too frozen in fear to move. They had nowhere to go, no way out. The creature was closing in, and the room seemed to grow smaller with every passing second. But just as David thought they were finished, something strange happened. The lights flickered, the walls seemed to bend and stretch, and in the blink of an eye, the creature's form twisted and rippled, distorting into something even more monstrous, more terrifying. David's eyes widened in shock, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature vanished. The room was silent, too silent. After the creature had vanished into thin air, an oppressive stillness settled over them. The flickering lights returned to their dim state, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the floor like dark fingers. The broken mirror lay in pieces, but the shattering sound still echoed in their ears, a reminder of the horrors they had witnessed. David's chest tightened as he slowly lowered the shard of glass he had been holding, his fingers still trembling. His mind was racing. What had just happened? The creature, the mirror, the whispers. None of it made sense. It was like the house itself was alive, playing some twisted game with them, and they were nothing more than pawns caught in its web. "Is it gone?" Emily whispered, her voice fragile, barely audible over the hum of the electric lights. Her wide eyes were fixed on the spot where the creature had been standing moments before, as though expecting it to reappear at any moment. David shook his head slowly, unsure of what to say. "I don't know, but I don't think it's over. It wants something from us." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. They all knew it was true. The house had been toying with them from the beginning, and now they were in its grip, unable to escape. "We can't stay here any longer," Mark said, his voice strained. He was breathing heavily, his face pale, and his hands were shaking. "We have to get out, find a way out. Now!" But even as he spoke, David felt the floor shift beneath them. The walls seemed to close in, the room growing smaller with each passing second. The shadows, once a mere trickle, now crawled across the room, creeping toward them with malevolent intent. Something had changed. The air was thick with a sense of impending doom, as if the very house itself was alive and aware of their every move. "We have to get to the front door," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. She had moved to the doorframe, her hand hovering over the handle as if testing whether it would open. "We can make it, right? We just need to get outside." But David knew better. They had tried to escape before, only to be led back to this cursed place. The house had no intention of letting them leave. "I don't think it's that simple," David muttered, his eyes scanning the room as he tried to make sense of what was happening. He felt as though he were trapped in some sort of nightmare, unable to wake up. Suddenly, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, moving in ways that didn't make sense. They grew darker, more dense, swirling together like a storm. The air grew heavier, and the oppressive silence that had hung in the room thickened, suffocating them. And then, from the shadows, a voice spoke. "You cannot leave." It was soft at first, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. A chill ran down David's spine as he recognized the voice, the same voice that had spoken through the creature. But this time it was different. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was the house itself speaking to them. David's heart raced as the walls around them seemed to groan and shift. The shadows pressed in on all sides, closing off the room like a tomb. He looked to his friends, his eyes wide with panic. "We have to move now," he shouted, his voice laced with fear. "Before it's too late." But it was already too late. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping them inside. The sound reverberated through the room, as though the house itself was sealing them in. David tried to turn the handle, but it was useless. The door wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, desperation flooding through him, but the door was immovable, as though it had become a part of the wall itself. The room grew colder. The shadows continued to creep closer, moving faster now, swirling and slithering around them. David could feel his heartbeat thundering in his chest, the noise deafening in his ears. And then, a loud screech filled the air. The windows, they were shattering. One by one, the windows cracked, the glass splintering into thousands of pieces, as if some unseen force had shattered them all at once. A gust of wind poured into the room, but it was cold, unnaturally cold, like the breath of something long dead. The temperature dropped, and the chill settled into their bones. "Get down!" Mark yelled, but it was too late. The shadows rushed forward, engulfing them in darkness. David stumbled back, his feet slipping on the broken glass as the shadows closed in. He couldn't see, couldn't breathe. Everything around him was consumed by the darkness. His heart raced in his chest, and panic began to claw at him. But just as the shadows reached out to take him, there was a blinding light. The walls around them seemed to dissolve, the darkness lifting in an instant. David blinked, disoriented, trying to make sense of what was happening. He could hear the others, their voices frantic, but it was as if they were speaking from far away. The world felt distant, unreal. And then, before his eyes, the house began to change. The walls shifted, stretching and warping like soft clay. The ceiling buckled, the floors buckled, and the room seemed to twist into a grotesque version of itself. The shadows that had once crawled in the corners now reached out like tendrils, wrapping around the room, growing in size. David's mind screamed for him to move, to get out, but his body wouldn't respond. It was like the house had seized control of him, trapping him in this distorted nightmare. And then, the voice returned. "You belong to me now." David turned toward the sound, but there was no one there. No one except the walls themselves. The voice was everywhere, surrounding him, seeping into his mind. It was deep, ancient, filled with malice. It was the voice of the house, the thing that had been watching them all along. It wasn't just a house, it was a living, breathing entity, and they were its prey. And in that moment, David knew. There was no escape, no way out, not anymore. With his heart pounding in his chest, he felt a surge of cold run through him. The darkness was closing in again. This time, there was no light to save them. "Run," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the thick silence. But it was too late. The shadows closed in around them, and they were swallowed by the house.